In the year 1837, in the state of Connecticut, a little boy was born that they named John Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan. We've introduced all types of men who built America, and it's based on the History Channel. The only one remaining is J.P. Morgan, so let's get to it. Unlike the other men who built America that had very hard lives and they grew up in a poor family, J.P. Morgan had a completely different life because he was born into a very wealthy family. J.P. Morgan's father was a very famous and successful banker named Junius Spencer Morgan, but he wouldn't give a cent to his son if he didn't work for it. There is even a story that's portrayed in the show that he put $1 million in front of J.P. and told him, "This is $1 million." J.P. thought this money is for him, but he soon after told him, "Learn how to earn it." He picks up the money and leaves. It's not like his father was cheap and didn't pay anything. He would give him the best education, anything that would help him become a better man, but he wouldn't just give out handouts for no reason. He would say, "I could help you out with some cash, but you gotta do something for me. Like, if you sweep my office, I'll give you $1. While all this is happening, J.P. Morgan does not have a very pleasant childhood because he's very sick and he has a type of infection in his lungs and he's always coughing. He would go to the best doctors, but it's still the 1800s, so the doctors couldn't do much to a child like this. He lives like this for a very long time until he turns 19 and all of a sudden he feels better. But even though he was very sick throughout his childhood, he did a lot of work. He went to school, learned a lot, and eventually, after feeling better, he was ready to get a job. Because of his name, when the place he went to get hired, which was on Wall Street, they realized that he's a Morgan, they immediately hired him. But now all of a sudden, his father was on his butt because he said, "You got this job because of me, and if you embarrass me, I'll ruin you." He was very serious about this. After a few months, J.P. Morgan realized that he can make a lot of money with this type of deal. He found a shipment of Brazilian coffee and he bought all of them and sold it on the same day for a huge profit, making a lot of money for the company. But this pissed off the owner of the business he was working at and his father. They told him, "You are too dangerous because what you did was too much of a risk." J.P. Morgan very quickly realized that these people aren't what he thought. They are scared to take a risk, which is why he decided to quit the job and told them, "You guys don't know how to make money." Even though his father was a very successful banker and the company he's worked for was very successful. But it was just the confidence of the young J.P. Morgan. He starts his own type of work to make money, and a few months later he meets the love of his life, Amelia Sturgis, and gets married with her. But unfortunately, after only 4 months, the love of his life dies. J.P. Morgan was devastated, and to forget about her, he only focused on his job, and he wanted to grow his newfound empire bigger and bigger. While J.P. Morgan is figuring out life, this is when the Civil War takes off, and J.P. Morgan is only 24 years old, so the army asked for him to join. But at this time, if you had some money, you could pay someone to go in your place. And that's exactly what J.P. Morgan did. He found someone that was much cheaper, so he paid only $300 for someone else to go for him to war. If you remember our video about Andrew Carnegie, he did the same exact thing because he's from the same era for $850. So J.P. Morgan saved a lot of money in this situation. But just like Cornelius Vanderbilt and Andrew Carnegie, the Civil War caused these people to get very wealthy. Like for example, one of the things J.P. Morgan would do during the war is take old retired rifles, take it to a shop that would restore them for a very low price, and then sell it back to the government for $22. This was a 600% profit, and the government was forced to buy all the weapons they could find. And JP Morgan knew this, so he took advantage of this opportunity. In the year 1871, JP Morgan is very wealthy and he's growing his empire slowly by slowly. But his father is still not impressed and tells him, "You still have a long ways to go, kid. You're not even close to me." This would cause JP Morgan to try even harder to surpass his father in power, and wealth. In a way, you could say his father knew this and he kept bugging him, and that would make him drive even harder. Maybe in private he was proud of his son, but he would never show it. This is when he gets familiar with another American banker named Anthony Drexel and tells him, let's create a bank. They create a new private bank called Drexel Morgan & Co., which exists to this day, but it's known as Chase. It's even called JP Morgan Chase now. It's at the year 1871 when the empire of JP Morgan is going up a notch. After this is only uphill. At this time, pretty much all the main business in the US is monopolized. Oil is in Rockefeller's hand, steel is in Carnegie's hands, and shipping and railroads is in Cornelius Vanderbilt's hand. But the only one that takes investors is Vanderbilt himself, because the other two are not interested. This is one of the reasons that JP Morgan heavily invested in Cornelius Vanderbilt's empire. As you know, Vanderbilt is much older than JP Morgan, so when he invests, he's not running the show anymore. It's actually his son, William Vanderbilt. But William didn't have the same drive and passion and knowledge as his father, so you could say he was holding the family name back. And in the year 1877, when Cornelius Vanderbilt dies, only 2 years later in 1879, the Vanderbilt empire took a toll because JP Morgan invested the most amount of money in railroad history and built the Pacific Railroad. And that means he had control over 1/3 of the United States Railroad. And that means Cornelius Vanderbilt's family did not have a monopoly in railroad anymore. If Vanderbilt himself was alive, he would not allow this to happen, but he no longer was around. JP Morgan is one of the richest people in the world now, but his father is still not impressed and doesn't show it. Do you see this picture? This is an edited photo of JP Morgan because he believed that he's not very good looking, and he would always tell the photographer to fix the photos before sending it out, especially for newspapers. And he hated paparazzis taking photos of him because he wasn't ready and they weren't going to be edited. He had a giant nose and he had a lot of pimples on it, so he was very insecure about it. But he was very tall at 6'2" or 188 centimeters. And that means just your stature and your scary look can be important in a business deal. You have to know, back in the day, this was very important, even for politicians. When you have a height like this and tower over every business partner, it's quite important when you're making a deal, because just your look can have a huge effect on it. Just like we said, a lot of politicians, especially in the 18th and 19th century, had this going for them. Like Otto von Bismarck was 6'4", and that helped a lot while making a deal or saying something to overpower someone. You could give an example for other leaders, like Reza Shah, the king of Iran. He was also 6'4", and you couldn't say no to him without feeling scared, just because of how he looked. This doesn't apply to today anymore, but back then it was quite important. Maybe that's the reason they had mustaches like this, because that would add to the scariness. So all we're trying to say is that in important people's lives, something like this that made you look like this was very important. It is at this time that JP Morgan gets familiar with the name Thomas Edison, and he realizes what an interesting thing he had invented. When he goes and sees it, he immediately invests in the company called Edison Electric Co. You could say it was JP Morgan that made Thomas Edison so famous around the world, and it was the reason that Edison could power the first part of Manhattan, one of the first towns that had electricity and lamps. Since JP Morgan was pretty much the main investor, they decided to change the name from Edison Electric to General Electric, which remains to this day. If you've seen our video about Andrew Carnegie, you'll know that when he reaches the age of 70, he says it's time to retire, and if anyone is interested in buying my company, I'm open to offers. As soon as JP Morgan realizes that Carnegie wants to sell, he immediately asks how much. He says 480 million. JP Morgan didn't even skip a beat, he says deal. It's interesting because later on in his life, JP Morgan said, if Andrew Carnegie said 518 million, I would have still paid for it. This was one of the biggest transactions in history at that time. And one of the first things JP Morgan did was change the name Carnegie Steel to US Steel. the first steel company in the world, and also the first billion-dollar company. When we get to the year 1893, we're heading towards a depression that's causing the economy to go down, and people are trading their US dollar for gold. And that adds on to the recession a lot more and causes the US dollar to collapse. While all this is happening, there's someone waiting for an opportunity like this, and he's the only one that could see it from afar. This is when JP Morgan basically bails out the US government and doesn't allow the entire government and the US dollar to collapse on itself and go bankrupt. He basically buys $650 million in gold bonds and bails the economy out. This is in the year 1893, and a number like this is ridiculous to fathom, but either way, JP Morgan got what he wanted. He became one of the most powerful men in the world by doing this. And this is why a lot of people were against the idea of a banker like this bailing out the United States government. This means a banker like this has way too much power in our government, and we don't like that. But JP Morgan wasn't alone in the empire business, because John D. Rockefeller was right next to him in other types of businesses, owning the entire country. And this was the very first time that the power of bankers and businessmen were much higher than the government itself. But this video was the story of JP Morgan, the final man who built America.